I think it's pretty solid advice.
Groups of cells in different parts of your brain, they're all connected.
The statistics just don't back it up. There's nothing here.
Any complex life you find has mitochondria.
We have discovered things from athletes juicing.
My name is Matt Kaeberlein, and welcome to the Optispan podcast.
So today I have another reaction video for you. So you actually talked about it in this video.
Okay.
So I was like, okay, I got to get Matt's opinion on it. It is about David Sinclair. And it's the journalist Scott Carney who, have you watched any of his other videos?
I have watched his Peter Attia video, and I think we should probably do a react video to that. I have not watched this one. I'm aware of this video, so it's probably worth giving a little bit of background context here. So as I've talked about before on the podcast, I've known David Sinclair since I was a graduate student. He was a postdoc in the Guarente lab when I started as a graduate student. Actually was a mentor to me during my graduate career. David really is the one who suggested my first project in the lab. And then, we've had our scientific differences over the years, including the resveratrol work that we have an episode on. So people should check that out if they're interested. It's been a challenging relationship. I don't really think we need to get into it other than to say that I have been somewhat disappointed in some of the behaviors that have gone on over the years. And then, as many people may know, I publicly left the academy based on the fact that David was president of the academy and selling NMN for pets and making dishonest claims about that. So I think people will perceive that I probably have a very negative opinion of David. Like I said, I haven't watched this video. Scott Carney emailed me and asked me to be interviewed for this video, which I turned down because I don't really want to be publicly out there bashing David. So I'm a little bit ambivalent about doing this react. I guess you guys will find out if we end up publishing it, because I'm going to wait and see how it goes. Simply because, I don't know what's going to be said. I will, again, I feel like I do a pretty good job of separating my sort of emotional disappointment in individuals from being able to try to evaluate the facts of the situation. So we'll see how it goes. But I haven't seen this video yet. So again, I'm a little bit wary, and we'll just kind of see how it goes.
Well, I'm happy you took this route because now we kind of post it on our channel and we get your opinion and kind of have the final sort of say on it. To just get the timeline straight, so you were in the lab before David?
No, he was in the lab.
Okay.
He'd been there for, I think, probably a year and a half at the time I joined the lab. I started in the lab as a first-year graduate student. This would have been, I guess, early 1998. So I started graduate school in September of 1997, and then started in the Guarente lab, probably March of 1998. So David was already there. Like I said, been there for about a year and a half. He had just, within the last year, published what at the time was sort of seen as an important paper in the field, which was a mechanism of aging. This was in single-celled yeast, but a mechanism of aging involving ribosomal DNA instability. And it was actually that story, among a couple of other things the lab had been working on, that really got me interested in studying aging when I heard Lenny give a talk on that. And so, like I said, David was extremely welcoming. I think, really I valued his advice and scientific insight, had, what I considered to be, very intellectually stimulating conversations with him. And like I said, he actually was the one who suggested a genetic screen that I did to look for mutations that suppressed some defects in the yeast sirtuin mutant. And that led to, much of my PhD thesis and at least contributed to kind of the first big result that I got out of my PhD, which was showing that you could overexpress sirtuin and increase lifespan in yeast. Again, we've got an episode on that on the podcast if people are interested, but that result really set the stage for sirtuins as a potential mediator of longevity.
Okay. Would you consider yourself like friends at the time? Like, did you get drinks or hang
I
out?
considered him a friend, yeah. And again, I think, this is where it gets challenging when the interpersonal relationships and science sort of clash, right? Absolutely, I considered David to be a mentor and a friend when I was in graduate school and even afterwards. That really soured when we couldn't reproduce the results from his lab on resveratrol. And again, I talked about that in depth in the episode on the podcast and in other places. I think, unfortunately, sometimes when scientific disagreements uh, uh, remain unresolved, that can complicate interpersonal relationships.
Yeah. So the first time I would have read your name would have been in his book, Lifespan. I think he speaks highly of you in the book too. So, anyway,
I haven't read it.
You
Sorry.
haven't read it? Oh, okay.
No.
I know I've seen comments of people wanting us to do a deep dive on it, but I don't know if you and I have the bandwidth for that. Read a whole book and prep an episode.
Yeah.
All right.
I'll just say I've got better things to do with my time.
Yeah, sure. All right, so here we go.
Like react to Scott Carney videos.
Yeah, this is more passive. All right, here we go. Start the video.
What if the key to a longer, healthier life was as easy to achieve as taking a simple and scientifically proven pill?
Well, what I'm going to tell you tonight, you would find extremely difficult to believe is true.
But one day we could be 80, but biologically 30.
It sounds amazing, but yeah, it does kind of sound too good to be true.
None of these claims are
our good
sound
friend Charlie Brenner.
Yeah.
Literature. This guy took Glaxo to the cleaners.
A few years ago, the world's largest pharmaceutical company put out a scientific paper that said that all of this science was wrong, dead wrong.
I knew it. But what would happen if after this scientist's work was roundly rejected, he found another pill?
And a man, and a man, and a man.
And this time, he was sure it would work.
Harvard professor David Sinclair got away with $720 million and is using the same strategy to do it again today.
The immortality grift is as old as humanity. It goes back at least to the Epic of Gilgamesh 5,000 years ago.
So, I mean, I think one thing I would say is I have never heard David talk about immortality as if it is a real likelihood. So to me, this feels, I mean, again, not surprising. They're going for clicks, but to me, this feels like kind of setting an unrealistic expectation that, that David's been claiming things that he, as far as I know, hasn't ever claimed. Now, there's plenty of stuff David has claimed that I take issue with, like reversing aging, or that, a molecule, NMN, most recently has been shown to reverse aging, at least in dogs. That's not true, and he has said that. There are plenty of things he said that aren't true that you don't have to make it sound like he's been trying to claim immortality.
Every single generation has launched its own breed of immortality grifters, and they all claim the same thing. Somehow, all the earlier generations were wrong, but this time, things will be different because they.
So, I mean,
they
again,
have the
I think
secret sauce.
the issue here is this is part of the unfortunate consequence of making dishonest claims or wild exaggerations is, again, David, and I don't think any legitimate scientist in the field has claimed that anything we're working on today is anywhere close to achieving immortality. But it is the case that it is possible. I think and this is where, the way that Scott's sort of starting this is as if the whole thing is fraud, right? Like, oh yeah, people have been saying for thousands of years that we can modulate aging, and that's never been true. Therefore, it's not true now. First of all, that's a logical fallacy to even take that approach, but it is true now. We actually understand the biology of aging enough that it is possible to modulate the aging process in laboratory animals, to slow aging, increase lifespan, improve health span, by some percentage points, 20%, 30%. It hasn't been proven in people, but it is possible. No question about it. And so again, unfortunately, that reality, when people make videos like this, sort of gets lumped in with the sort of immortality snake oil stuff. And I think because some people operate at that sort of interface where they're both in the scientific world and in the snake oil world, kind of all gets jumbled up. And I don't think, at least so far, the way this is being presented helps clarify for the average person where the science stops and where the nonsense begins.
Kind of mixes
We'll
it.
see where we end up, but so far I'm not impressed.
And in every single generation, kings and titans of industry sunk their vast fortunes into speculative ideas that have so far never paid off. This is the story of the most
This is a logical fallacy. Of course, so far never paid off in terms of immortality, right? Duh, but that doesn't mean that it's not scientifically valid or possible to modulate the biology of aging, right?
And what I'm hearing is something is science fiction before it becomes science. So like going to the moon in the 1800s was science fiction, and today it's science.
That's true. And yet going to a different galaxy is still science fiction, and it's not science, and it's not within the realm of anything that's likely to happen. I mean, I think that's the analogy here. He's making the claim that because people have talked about wormholes and traveling to different galaxies, for hundreds of years, it is impossible to consider traveling to the moon.
I see. Yeah.
Right? So I think that's maybe more the analogy in this case. And clearly we've traveled to the moon, right? So now you could say, well, but nobody's ever traveled to Mars. Yeah. Someday somebody will. That's within our grasp. And I think that's where this disconnect comes from. It is sometime, I believe, in the very near future, we will have clinical evidence that we can modulate the biology of aging in humans in a way that increases lifespan and health span. Some would argue we already have that if to the extent you believe these biological age clocks are actually measuring biological aging, right? So we're not that far away from that. Are we anywhere near immortality? Not that I can tell.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we can't have an impact on health span and lifespan.
I have heard David give a sort of a theoretical idea of longevity escape velocity for every chronological era you go forward.
Yeah, I wish he wouldn't do that. I mean, it's a good thought experiment, I guess. Again, no evidence we're anywhere near achieving that, and that's where you get into the realm of these futurists who speculate. Those are people who, in my view, are either intentionally misleading folks or don't really understand the data and where the biology is right now. Doesn't mean it's impossible. And yes, theoretically, if the human race doesn't destroy itself, someday we may get to that point. No evidence we're getting close now. And people will point to, well, what about AI? Who knows what's going to happen with AI, right? Yeah. But there's no evidence yet that we're getting close to longevity escape velocity.
Something I wanted to get your opinion on is I've been thinking a lot about how these companies who are trying to sell stuff, they present the problem, then they sell the solution. So the problem is you're getting cramps because you're eating keto diet. Solution is drink our electrolyte powder. And this is the ultimate problem. It's aging, which is why you have so many companies trying to sell a solution.
That's right. And no real way to validate whether it's working or not. I mean, that's the beauty of making claims around anti-aging or longevity escape velocity. You can make those claims. Nobody can prove you wrong. If you are wrong, you're going to be dead before they can prove you wrong. So
yeah, and then they have your money. So
right.
Yeah.
Immortality grift. And while there have been many people offering up eternal life, from uploading brains to the cloud to cryogenics, the most notable longevity biologist in the last 25 years has been the Harvard geneticist David Sinclair. And until a few
That's debatable.
He seems like the real deal, a beacon of scientific innovation and hope. But then someone sent me a tip, someone who said they wanted to remain anonymous. And
is that you?
No, actually we should clarify that is absolutely not me. So I as I said, Scott asked me to be interviewed for this video. I politely declined by email. I definitely did not send him a tip about David or anybody else.
Isn't just a deep dive into the spurious health claims that I often dig into on this channel, because Sinclair, well,
he doesn't like Huberman, does he?
One of the most successful health grifters of all time, raising billions, and yes, billions of dollars in investment over his career based on results that he might have simply made up.
The story begins in 1999, where lab partner of David Sinclair, Matt
that's my boss,
Kaeberlein, showed that if you overactivate an enzyme called sirtuin in yeast, you can cause a 30% extension in lifespan.
Here's how Sinclair explains those same results.
What we found was that these yeast cells, as they got older, after about a week, all the genes started to come on, and they died. Now
So that's bullshit.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, well, first of all, I'll just be gracious and assume he's using we as in the entire lab, because David had nothing to do with this work. But sirtuin in yeast, which is what we're talking about here, affects gene expression at only 3 very specific locations in the genome. And what we showed was that in the deletion mutant, which is short-lived, the shortening of lifespan is due to actually not even really gene expression, but a loss of stability within what's called the ribosomal DNA. So you get hyperrecombinations, DNA damage sort of phenotype. So the gene expression model has nothing to do with the lifespan effect that we showed, we being Mitch McVeigh and myself and Lenny, who was the senior author on the paper, back in 1999 when that paper was published. But people can look. David's not on that paper. He had nothing to do with this work.
Yeah, I see the 3 names there. And
yeah.
So you're the first name. Does that mean anything in particular?
I mean, so Mitch and I are technically co-first authors, Mitch McVeigh. So that means we equally contributed to the data that was generated. And then Lenny, as the head of the lab, was the supervisor of the research.
So we can cut this out. But one question is like, does it feel weird that he built his sort of foundation, his career, which made him a lot of money off of something that you were a lead author on?
Actually, he didn't. I mean, he didn't really build his career off of this work. It was really the NAD work of Suju Lin that when David left the lab, because again, he had nothing to do with that work, and really wasn't working on NAD at all until he left the lab, and then he took what he knew of Suju's work and brought that to his own lab, and then had people in his lab start working on it. So if anybody has reason to be upset, I would say that Suju probably does.
Okay, all right.
But you know, that's kind of the way science works in certain places, and Boston in particular, and Harvard and MIT in particular seem to be places where that sort of stuff happens. You know, for better or worse, brilliant people, often hyper competitive, often willing to take other people's ideas and run with them.
The other thing is I was getting my bachelor's in 2013, and I remember at the time thinking TED Talks were like the gold standard for scientific rigor.
Yeah.
I'd watch them in my free time.
Now it's YouTube, right?
Yeah. Do you feel like TED Talk credibility has dropped in the last decade? Or
I mean, I think certainly interest in TED Talks has dropped. Again, I never was a big fan of TED Talks because it is often as much about the spin as it is about the reality of the topic. And so I really am personally prefer to deal in facts and data and reality as much as possible and not get lost in the hype and the spin.
Okay. That's something I've learned here is before working Optispan, I let people like Sinclair, for example, kind of be the middleman between me and the literature. Yeah. And now working here, I just read it for myself.
Yeah, and I mean, you can't be an expert on everything, so you do have to do that to some extent. But I think, you know, there are different venues and forums for the type of information that you want to digest, and I much more prefer to get the information in a less flamboyant way, and hopefully from sources that are more credible, so that I can then, to the extent that I have background knowledge, evaluate what the information that I'm being given in the context of that background knowledge and make my own decisions about, you know, how much credibility do I give it.
That process down. We could find genes that could switch off those rogue genes and silence them. And this led to a discovery of a longevity gene called sirtuin.
His papers were sensational, but there were some problems.
What would you consider the odds that something that a fungal cell does anticipates the causes of aging and death?
100%.
Humans.
We already know that's true. This is, I mean, again, this is being, there's a couple issues being conflated here. One is sirtuin and resveratrol. As we talk about on our episode, resveratrol probably doesn't actually activate sirtuin or sirtuins in generally. Most people probably already know this, but sirtuins are the family of proteins of which sirtuin is the founding member. So they're all related. Okay. So the idea that because resveratrol is bullshit, sirtuins are bullshit. That doesn't make any sense because the whole idea that resveratrol is an activator of sirtuins is wrong, generally speaking. And then this idea, and I mean, again, Charlie's been on the show. He's a friend of the show. A lot of respect for Charlie in his domain. He doesn't really understand the biology of aging to any great depth. Sorry, Charlie. I know you're not going to like that. We already know that things that affect aging in yeast affect aging in mammals. mTOR, obviously. So this idea that just because something works in yeast, it's not going to be true in mammals or vice versa, it's been disproven. So trying to discredit sirtu because it came out of yeast, I think there are other reasons why you can question the extent to which sirtuins affect aging in mammals. But the fact that it came from a study in yeast, which, by the way, has stood the test of time. I mean, this study has been highly reproducible. Nobody questions whether or not overexpressing sirtuin in yeast increases lifespan. And there's some reason to believe that sirtuins may affect aging. They're certainly in the same network with mTOR in other organisms. I just don't think they're particularly good nodes in that network to tweak. So I think Charlie's criticisms here are not based in data or logical thought. They're based on emotion, in my opinion.
Every aspect of the sirtuin aging hypothesis has fallen apart.
It also should be noted that Brenner
That's
works
a little bit of an overstatement. So as I just got done saying, the yeast component has not fallen apart. In fact, it's been reproduced over and over and over again. And I think even the idea that sirtuins can regulate aging in worms and flies, a little bit unclear. There's been controversy, but it hasn't been disproven. And if you believe the literature on SIRT6, which is a mammalian sirtuin, that seems to affect aging in mammals. So to simply say that the entire idea that sirtuins have anything to do with aging has fallen apart is not true. It's at a minimum an overstatement, and it neglects literature that is supportive of that idea. Do I think the sirtuin hypothesis in aging has been overhyped and overblown, and that there has been data there that has not been reproducible? Absolutely. To say there's nothing there is just not accurate.
Yeah, throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
None of that stuff is repeatable, right? Even by people
so again,
with the same
I don't really know this guy, but it's just not true. Like, just to say that all of the work that David did as a postdoc, none of it has been repeatable is just not true. All of the work on the ribosomal DNA circles is repeatable. I reproduced some of it when I was a graduate student. Other people have. So yeah, are there questions about some of the data that David has published, particularly since he left Lenny's lab? Yeah, there are questions, and some of that hasn't been reproducible. But to say that nothing has been reproducible, I just don't think it's useful to make false claims like that. If you want to make a case that somebody has a pattern of producing data that, has problems, you make the case with specific examples. You're not going to convince people by just saying, oh yeah, everything this person does is wrong. It's especially when it's, easy to disprove that statement. So I just don't get why people do that.
While resveratrol could indeed have health benefits, they didn't work through the mechanisms that Sinclair said existed. Indeed, for which Sinclair was getting rich promoting. After he pushed his ideas in magazines and on TV shows and on TED Talks for more than a decade, in 2008, Sinclair sold his company to the pharmaceutical giant GlaxoSmithKline for $720 million. Even a slight statistical improvement in lifespans would make them billions of dollars in profit. The marketing guys loved it, but according to Sclafani, they were blindsided by the potential profits and didn't listen to their scientific cohort.
So that's true. So again, a couple of things I can just add for context there. So that happened in 2008. We published in 2004. Again, we did a podcast episode on this, that the model that resveratrol activated sirtu or sirT1, the human homologue of sirtu, was incorrect. I mean, we proved that biochemically, as did John Deneu's lab. So, that was out there in the scientific literature. The folks at Glaxo had every opportunity to know that. In fact, I know they knew of that data because people who I know were advising them as they were going through this process. It is also true that at least some of the scientists at Glaxo knew that resveratrol did not activate sirtuins. I know that because I talked to those people. I actually went out to visit one of the Glaxo locations, I don't know, 2006, 2007, something like that. So yeah, it is accurate that at least some of the scientists within Glaxo were saying, don't do this. It's based on shoddy science. And I don't have any insight into the decision-making process when they chose to buy Sirtuin, other than to know that some of the people involved in that process were in fact being given advice that they should run away very quickly, and they chose not to.
Yeah, I just want to add around that time. So 2009, I was working at GNC, and I was selling a lot of resveratrol.
Yeah,
they were
it was
pushing
pretty popular
hard
there for a while.
Yeah.
The Sirtu hypothesis was junk. And Sinclair made out like
again,
a bandit.
They're conflating here the resveratrol story with the Sirtu biology. And I think it's important to separate those two things, because the resveratrol activating sirtuins and increasing lifespan is junk. That's been disproven. The role of sirtuins in aging biology, I think, is still an open question.
His papers get accepted because people that are accepting his papers, he accepts their papers.
Yeah.
Right?
So it's probably worth stopping here for a second, because I mean, I think there is some truth to what he's saying. And I think a lot of us in the field wondered for many years how it is the case that some of David's papers and some of the other papers on sirtuins and also on NAD keep getting published in high-profile papers when the flaws are obvious to anyone. I mean, it's like you look at the papers, you're like, who reviewed this piece of garbage, right? And I know lots and lots of people who have said that and feel that way. And I think there probably is some truth that there is this buddy system where, you know, I'll give your paper a softball review, you give my paper a softball review. Are the editors in on it? I tend to not think so. And I know some of these editors, and I think, you know, in general, they're trying to do a good job, but I don't know for sure. And it is a question how it is that some people seem to get a different peer review process than other people. And it's often high profile people from places like Harvard and MIT. That's real. But I think this idea that they're all in on it is probably it's almost certainly overstated. Like, I don't think it's as nefarious as that. I think it's corrupt, but not necessarily corrupt with the intent to deceive. It's more corrupt with the intent to be successful in my career. Meaning, if I get a paper in Cell Science or Nature published, that helps me get grants, that helps me get promoted. And if we help each other get papers published in these top journals, then we both win, right? Yeah. I don't think it's usually the case that I'm trying to get bad data published. It's more, let's just help each other out. But I don't know. But I tend not to think that it's so much the editors that are driving this. Although sometimes editors do overrule reviewers. That's pretty rare.
Do you think part of the frustration is there's not much money in geroscience? When people see it going down the wrong route, they want to reallocate it, or they wish?
No, I don't think so. I think this is probably true. In fact, I know it's true in every field. There are imbalances in the peer review process. I think in geroscience or aging biology, because the topic is somewhat sensational, it is maybe more inclined to abuse for high profile publications, because people are interested naturally, right? People are much more interested. The broader community, the general public, are much more interested in longevity than they are in, you know, this slight conformational change for a bacterial protein, right? So I think the nature of the topic sort of predisposes to bad decision-making by journal editors, because it is true, some journals are for-profit journals, Nature and Cell in particular, and there is an incentive to publish papers that are going to get a lot of attention. And I will say, again, you know, I feel like among the big three, so there's Cell Science and Nature, in our field, maybe not so much anymore, but certainly in the 90s, 2000 to 2010, when you look at the big three, Cell was by far the worst. There was just a bunch of garbage aging papers published in Cell. Really, really bad stuff. Nature, there were a few, including the resveratrol paper. And then I think Science probably had the best quality paper. But in all of those cases, and this is going to be true regardless, there's no perfect system. There's always going to be mistakes that get through. There's going to be misinterpretations that get through the system. That's not going to change. But you did see a lot of repeat offenders show up in Cell for sure.
Is it same today or a little better now?
I think it's gotten a little bit better, but in part the field has expanded. So there aren't so many big dominant names in the field anymore that are able to do that sort of repeat offense model.
Like so many things in society, people with power and influence are able to get their way almost irrespective of what is right or even just. I've pointed out how this same old boy network has allowed scientists like Andrew Huberman and Peter Attia to use their positions to alter the scientific publication process.
So wait a minute, hold on. So, okay, Scott, why don't you show us the publication records of Andrew Huberman and Peter Attia, and we'll see how much they've actually dominated the literature.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Attia's an MD.
I don't even know if Peter's published in the scientific literature. So,
yeah, he helps raise funds, I know, like Dog Aging Project or whatnot.
Yeah.
But that's different.
Yeah. Come on, you can do better than that. So, I don't think bashing the scientific process, sort of broadly speaking, based on a bitter scientist is necessarily the best approach here, and making sort of broad, unjustified claims.
Okay. I wanted to add, so in the podcast community, there's a bunch of comedy podcasts. So LA and New York, they all have different scenes. And there's these channels that have hundreds of thousands of subscribers and millions of views. All they do is they like criticize and poke fun. And it's becoming a market of like, you have these big podcasts like Huberman and Attia, and you can have these sub channels that are growing just by calling out. And so this feels like the scientific version or the journalist version of that thing that's happening in the comedy world.
I don't know. Yeah. I mean, again, I think he's trying to be an investigative journalist, but there's a lot of sensationalism here and a lot of statements, at least so far, that just aren't accurate or are over the top, right? And sort of, bundling a bunch of stuff under a larger umbrella and making inaccurate statements on that larger umbrella. Sure, there's corruption for sure. And, I'm sure you can find things to criticize David Sinclair and Andrew Huberman and Peter Attia about, but this idea that they're all part of this old boys network that's contaminating the scientific literature is just not true.
I want to give a little bit of compliment sandwich too, because I do subscribe to Scott, and he has sort of opened my eyes to some other things. So I think there's a need for people like him, but it's just sort of filtering out.
I guess, I agree. I guess the question would be, the things he's opened your eyes to, are they real or not? Like, how do you know?
Yeah,
right? Because if you don't have my background, you might not know what I just said. Right?
Very true.
And according to Sclafani and Brenner, Sinclair was able to influence the publication process for his own personal profit.
So let's stop there.
To the
So that may be true, this last statement. Sinclair was able to influence the publication process for his own personal profit. I would be interested to know whether Charlie or Sclafani actually have any data to back that up, because that's a pretty serious accusation. Show us the data, right? It might be true, and I think it probably is, but I'm not going to walk around making that accusation unless I can actually back it up. The other thing I would say is, yes, scientists are human beings, and scientists are motivated by the same kinds of motivations that influence every other human being in the world, right? Money's one of them. It's certainly not the only one. Recognition, being respected, being successful in your career, taking care of your family, all of that stuff comes into play. And so I don't think scientists are intrinsically any better or any worse than anyone else. They're operating in a system where the incentives are misaligned. And I think there are real problems with the scientific publication process. it's not primarily money, really. And this is probably a separate issue, but it's also not new. Like he implies like, oh, now that we have podcasters on YouTube, things are suddenly worse. Look, I dealt with this and trying to clean up the literature, when I was a postdoc, when I couldn't reproduce results that were important for my research. This has been happening for decades. I don't think there's a lot new. I think the landscape has maybe changed a little bit. The funding has become a little bit more competitive, but it's not as if, there's corruption run rampant. The vast majority of scientists are trying to do good science, are trying to get the right answers. Some of them haven't been trained to the highest standards. There's actually, in my experience, being in this world for, 20 plus years, doing research, running a research lab, blatant dishonesty is pretty rare. Mistakes get made and misinterpretations happen a lot, again, because I think a lot of scientists are not trained well in critical thinking or the scientific method. But I think intent, by and large, among scientists is pretty good. And this idea that, science is hugely corrupt, I think is just bullshit. And it's unfortunate when people who don't really know what they're talking about imply that.
You think it's probably less rare in YouTube scientists than it is in labs?
I don't think there are that many YouTube scientists. How many people on YouTube are legit doing research actively?
Yeah, not many.
I mean, the big names.
Mm-hmm.
Any?
Yeah. Oh, you mean that like they still have a lab or like they're...
Yeah, they're actively publishing research papers, running a lab, getting grants, doing the scientific enterprise.
I don't know. I know one of his complaints is that certain people, almost use Huberman as an example, go from, he calls it petri dish to protocol. So he'll cherry pick one study that says whatever, something about light, and then he'll say, here's a protocol I want my audience to do.
Yeah, no, that's a different thing though. That's not publishing misinterpretation or bad data in the scientific literature. That's doing science on YouTube, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Which is very different. And again, I think there are problems there too. That's not the scientific scientific process that's the problem, though. That is a different problem.
Harvard takes a cut of any IP that their professors take to market, even if that IP is ultimately based on a lie. So while Sinclair profited the most from his grift, the institution had every incentive to keep it going. It's a similar phenomenon that we see where top influencers all go on each other's podcasts and promote whatever junk idea the other is promoting.
So hold on.
Everyone is playing.
How are those equivalent? I don't get it. Harvard not firing David being equivalent to podcasters going on each other's podcasts. That doesn't make any sense. So I do think this question of, why hasn't Harvard taken action is legitimate. I think, again, many people in the field, the scientists in the field, have wondered this for a long time. I suppose profit may be part of it, although I'm doubtful given the absolute magnitude of dollars here. You think about the total value of the Harvard endowment and the 0.1% that they might be getting from patents that David has filed through Harvard. I just doubt those dollars add up to the point where it's a significant incentive for Harvard. I suspect it's much more related to the challenges that go along with disciplining faculty at these institutions. And that's more built into the faculty structure. And honestly, universities are mostly about covering their own butts, right? 90% of what universities do with respect to their faculty is really avoiding any opportunity where they can get in trouble, right? So they take all sorts of steps to be able to disavow or distance themselves when things go wrong. And so part of that is a hesitancy to take disciplinary action against faculty members because the faculty members can come back and sue them, basically, and often win just because of the structures that are in place. So I don't know, maybe profit is part of it, but I also suspect it has something to do with just it's too much of a headache to try to go through that process. So I would guess they're trying behind the scenes to say, hey, come on, knock it off for a little while, let things settle down. Let's just, not raise any attention for a little bit. I honestly don't know, though. I haven't been obviously involved in any of that, but just my experiences at University of Washington and other places makes me believe it probably isn't so much about the money.
Was the comparison he was trying to make is that both Harvard and the YouTube science world are both old boy networks? Maybe not necessarily connected, but we've talked about the same.
How can the YouTube science network be an old boy net?
Well, like we've talked about how like the same 10 people do each other's podcast. Without naming
sure.
names, but you see them, they help each other share an audience, and you haven't really been a part of that.
I don't really see the equivalency though with Harvard not taking action against the faculty member. Like I don't. It does not. Maybe I'm just not seeing it. I don't get it.
I'm just trying to think about where he was coming from. So
I'm not sure I believe there's really an old boy network the way he's talking about it.
At least in terms of Harvard.
In terms of the sort of academic science community in the field.
Okay.
And he's doing this entire playbook again with a different molecule called NMN. He hyped NMN up on the Joe Rogan podcast, and lots of people started taking it.
He's claiming that he's cured vision in mice. He's claiming that he has a company that is curing vision.
So hold on, let's stop for a second. Completely different project. The Vision project is using epigenetic reprogramming, nothing to do with NMN.
He's claiming that he's reversed functional aging in mice, and none of these claims are sound in the experimental literature.
Evidence aside, can you guess what happened next? In a matter of weeks, domestic and foreign supplement companies opened up a new market for NMN powders and pills based on Sinclair's endorsement alone.
So largely, it's a totally fake space where people are just basically surfing on the David Sinclair aura that you don't have to age, and that NMN is going to activate.
I mean, again, anybody who's watching the podcast or seen our other episodes knows I am not a proponent of NMN, but to say that it's a totally fake space, again, is just not true. There is a body of literature using NMN, just like there is with NR, imperfect literature, several things that haven't been reproducible, but some things that look pretty solid, suggesting that treatment with NMN can have impacts on certain disease conditions in mice, potentially some impacts in humans. So again, to say that it's all just, there's nothing there is as inaccurate, in my view, as claiming that NMN reverses aging. It's the data is somewhere in the middle, and where you fall in terms of how much you believe that NMN is likely to ultimately have an impact on healthspan or lifespan. I think it's legitimate there's a gray area there, but it's neither extreme. And so again, I kind of feel like, I guess so far, we're getting towards the end. My view of this video is, while the underlying problems and concerns are absolutely valid, this is mostly like just people saying stuff without a lot of specific facts to back it up. There's plenty of facts. Like, you could make a very factual case against David Sinclair if you wanted to. This, to me, has not been compelling so far.
Just a lot of it's coming from emotion, like you mentioned earlier. Maybe, or
yeah, I guess. I mean, maybe it's just that I'm thinking about this more from, like, if this was a court case, right?
Yeah.
You'd want to actually be able to lead people in a logical way. Here's this specific example. Here's this specific example, and the data to back it up. This is mostly just like people's opinions and overstatements. To me, that's what it feels like.
Is that court case something you feel like you'd ever want to do, or no? I feel like there's demand.
I mean, I already did it in the scientific literature. We already did it.
I see.
With resveratrol, at least.
Yeah, sure.
So I sort of feel like, given that was largely ignored for several years until people realized, oh yeah, these guys were right. Like, like I said, I've got other things that I'd rather spend my time doing than cleaning up other people's messes.
Yeah, you're busy. Like, outside of the podcast, you do a lot of other stuff. So I don't think some people don't realize that. But.
Well, it got super weird when Sinclair used his relationship with the FDA to effectively corner the NMN market he created by going on Rogan. Now, this led the FDA to issue a letter that effectively made that supplemental NMN that all his competitors were selling illegal.
So again, I think this is This is true. So I'm interested, though, that he said that David used his relationship with the FDA. Like, what relationship?
Yeah.
Where is the evidence to support that? I mean, it implies that there's like this, backroom kind of stuff going on. I haven't heard that. Again, maybe it's true, but I've never heard that before.
Yeah. And if he can't prove these things, wouldn't that make him liable for defamation?
I mean, again, this is sort of stated in a way that,
he's covering it. Okay.
Relationship with the FDA. Like, what do I really mean by that? But it does imply that there was this corrupt process. When my understanding of the situation is that this is really more of a bureaucratic, structural thing. And this is the way Charlie sort of described it as well, where because Metro Biotech, that's the company, had gotten this patent and started the human clinical trials first, under current FDA guidelines, they are able to have NMN classified as a drug rather than a generally recognized as safe natural product, which can be marketed over the counter. So I think it's completely non-scientific. There is no reason why NMN should be classified as a drug when NAD, NR, nicotinamide, niacin are not. But given the current FDA guidelines, it's my understanding that this, in fact, was the correct legal decision for FDA to make. I'm not even 100% positive that it's a law. Like, this is where it's a little bit gray, and I've tried to look into this, but there are companies still selling NMN. Technically, they're not supposed to by FDA guidelines, which is why Amazon and Google won't show you those results. But is it against the law? Not completely clear to me. I tend to think it probably isn't. It's against the guidelines. So again, but that's a different issue. But the way it was framed here, I think, is designed to lead people to believe something that, as far as I know, there's no evidence to support. That David had this sort of, back channel relationship with FDA that caused them to make this decision in favor of his company. Is it possible? Sure, but I don't think there's any evidence to support it, at least none that I know of.
Yeah.
Technically speaking, only David Sinclair can sell NMN in America right now, even though...
Well, again, actually, it's Metro Biotech, not David, right? So yes, he's a co-founder of the company. So I guess that maybe that's a reasonable way to frame it. I wouldn't frame it that way, though.
Okay.
The FDA issued some provisional rulings on the matter, and the entire market at the moment, well, it's in limbo until they come up with a final ruling on whether the natural chemical in food is a drug or not.
Okay, so that answers the question about whether it is currently a law or a guideline. It sounds like it's a preliminary decision.
The claims are so obviously insane, it's hard for me to even find the words. So once again, I'll just use his. Here's another TED Talk where he's talking about growing mini brains that are conscious to test how NMN makes them younger.
These are human pluripotent stem cells that have been engineered into little mini brains. On the left of this image, you can see these are little organoids. These are quite similar to human brains. They have electrical activity. And on the right is the electrodes that we put the brains on. We can measure that. We think they dream, they have thoughts.
It's alive, it's alive, it's alive.
And we can also age them using our technology of disrupting the epigenome. And now we've shown that if you reset the age of those little brains, they get their ability to think again. The electrical activity comes back.
It's outrageous. It really is outrageous. I mean, think? What does he mean by he's a philosopher now, right? It's not really science anymore. Now he's a philosopher. They're thinking, really? Come on.
I can't even express.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with that. It's over the top ridiculous. Although, this is part of the frustration, right? Is David's a brilliant guy. He's a brilliant scientist. And yet he repeatedly crosses that line into dishonesty, or in a case like this, into just complete nonsense.
Do you
I don't know what causes that motivation, but it's very disappointing.
This is speculation on your end, but do you think he believes that they think, or is it more interesting?
No, he's a smart guy.
Yeah.
No.
Interesting.
The longevity institute that Sinclair founded was called the Academy for Health and Lifespan Research, and it started to fall apart. One of its members, Matt Kaeberlein, posted on Twitter that Sinclair was a snake oil salesman, and within a matter of days, Sinclair was forced to step down. Scads of newspaper articles, including in the Wall Street Journal, as well as my fellow health misinformation fighters here on YouTube, took apart Sinclair's evidence.
So, I mean, I should probably comment on this since I was the precipitating event here. I think this is all accurate, right? That I resigned from the academy publicly, and it led to eventually David being asked to resign and doing that as president of the academy. Obviously, this wasn't the first time. As I've said, we published back in 2006 that resveratrol doesn't activate sirtuin, and that ran contradictory to David's results. Published several papers since then, basically stating that we were unable to reduce aspects of what David published. Been public many times saying that. I'm not quite sure why on this occasion, like it is hardly the case that this is the first time I have publicly stood up and said, this is not true, right? When it comes to things that David has said or published. I'm not completely sure why this time it had the effect that it did. I think it's a good thing. It really was not my intention to have this blow up into as big of a deal as it did. Honestly, I mean, the honest truth is what caused me to do this publicly was the fact that he said that he had something that reversed aging in dogs, which was completely untrue based on the paper, the preprint, not even a paper that was published. There was no data in there to support that it did anything really beneficial for dogs at all. And the fact that it's dogs, it just pissed me off. And I'm like, you know what? I'm done. I'm done being part of this organization that David's the president of when we have somebody out there lying and selling snake oil. So not only was it selling a product for which there is no real evidence of benefit, it was lying about it, taking advantage of pet owners. And there's another preprint suggesting that the product may actually cause kidney damage, at least in aged mice. So it was all of those things together that just really upset me. And I'm like, you know what? I just don't want to be involved with this organization anymore. But, on the surface, every single scientist in the field knew that it was a lie. The statement in the press release that, this is the first product shown to reverse aging in dogs. Every single scientist in the field knew that was a lie. It still pisses me off that I was the only one to say anything. And that really, I think, is the bigger issue here. Like when that sort of behavior has gotten normalized to the point where nobody even blinks, that's a real problem for the longevity scientific community. And so that to me, I think, is something that still hasn't really been resolved. As far as I know, David is still a member of the Academy. And that company is still selling this product. So the scientists in the community are continuing to allow this sort of behavior to happen unchecked. And I think that's a bad thing for the scientific community. And I think it does contribute to videos like this. Like if the scientists were being responsible, we wouldn't need Scott Carney to be doing these kinds of videos on misbehavior by scientists, right? Which makes everyone look bad. So there is some truth to that.
Yeah, well, I respect that. It's funny. It's like humans wasting their money. Like you're pissed messing with dogs. It's like,
I know, right?
Not too far.
Yeah. You can tell where my priorities are.
Throughout every age, people have come up with the idea that it's possible to achieve immortality, or at least some semblance of it, with the right magic pill or protocol. And while certainly humans are living longer and better now than ever before, there never has been and likely never will be a magic bullet. But
so hold on, stop.
From reaching for one.
Stop. Okay. Again, this is nobody's talking about immortality here, Scott. Okay. I think you need to get informed on the biology of aging before you make statements like that, because there are good reasons to think that there are real advances being made. Again, this is the sort of point I was just making, that misbehavior by high-profile people in the field damages the credibility of the field and allows people like Scott Carney to kind of lump the whole field together under the umbrella of snake oil and bad behavior. There are very good reasons to think that there are therapeutics close to being available, maybe already available, that can have a significant impact on health span and potentially lifespan in dogs and people. That's going to happen. And nobody's talking about immortality, but to suggest that that's not going to happen is just, it's wrong. And it reflects a complete ignorance of where the science actually is.
Yeah, I could tell he's an author, like he writes books, as you can see with this video, he tried to create this sort of conclusion and sort of opening, like a theme. With that said, Scott, I'd love to see you on the podcast. You're welcome, dog.
Anytime we can have a conversation and hammer it all out. Yep. And again, I think what I told Scott in the email was that I appreciate the need for this kind of work when I said I didn't want to be part of it. But I would like to see it, as I've sort of already said, my preference would be to see it done in a way that makes a much more factual case than this sort of emotion-driven conspiracy theory stuff.
You think this gets more views, though? It's a part of it? The narrative?
Probably, but again, I guess if your goal is to get clicks, you do it one way. If your goal is to be credible, you do it a different way.
Closing thoughts?
I mean, I think I've sort of already said it, but but again, I think so. There's a lot of truth to the story, right? That he's trying to tell. Again, I would find it much more compelling if it was more factual and backed up by solid data than based on opinions and insinuation. And it feels like there was way too much opinion and insinuation, which again, I obviously tend to be a fairly critical thinker. And so those things to me make me less likely to believe the overall story when it's not, when there aren't those facts given in a very detailed way. Maybe this is more effective. And again, I think if one of the goals is to raise attention to individuals who are potentially bad actors, maybe this achieves that goal. But I worry that this kind of an approach that, again, is not really based on facts and is based much more on storytelling, can be misused against people who are really good actors. Like this guy could probably come up with a fairly well-produced video targeting me, right? And look, folks, I got, as far as I know, no skeletons in my closet. Like I'm pretty open book. But you can make it into a story that sounds, as if there is this hidden corruption and, seedy sort of behavior without any real facts. And that's my concern, is that, that I didn't really feel like the details were nailed down.
I wish what I could see is like an alternate timeline. If you did do one of these Zoom calls with him and gave your advice, like how would this video have looked? Would you have sort of added that rigor? Would
my statements have been taken out of context? Like, I don't know. I don't know.
No way of knowing. So the other thing too is I don't know if we want to, we did invite David on the podcast months ago.
Yeah.
So I feel like when we're talking about someone, I want the audience to know that, and he politely, declined, which is great, but that this isn't just like a one-way sort of thing, and that we have given him an opportunity.
I would love to sit down with David and hammer some of this stuff out. I don't think he will, because I don't think, my guess is he's not prepared to be for that level of honesty, right? To actually sit down and have an honest conversation about some of this stuff.
It's easier in front of someone like Rogan who can't push back and who has a giant platform.
And that's not the point of that conversation, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so lastly, I mean, we do have the tradition of looking at the comments. So let's dive in. Once again, the secret to longevity is your credit card number. The bigger question, why are places like Stanford and Harvard legitimizing people like Huberman?
I mean, I actually think that's a legitimate question. I don't want to talk about Huberman, but I mean, I do think it's a legitimate question when there is pretty clear misbehavior. Again, I think, in the case of David and some other people, oftentimes you will hear it, the sort of misbehavior be characterized as, oh, it's just an exaggeration, right? And there is this gray area of when does it cross that line? But to my mind, selling something and claiming that it reverses aging in people's dogs, like that's pretty black and white.
Yeah.
When there's no data to support that, no evidence at all. And I think you do have to ask, why would a prestigious institution like Harvard not take action? And again, I don't think it's about the money. I don't know for sure, but I don't think the money is enough. I think there are probably other reasons, but it is a legitimate reason. Like, I'm guessing Harvard has a faculty code, and I'm guessing lying about your research is against that faculty code.
Yeah.
Why don't they do something about it? Legit question.
Yeah, I don't know. All right, so forget David Sinclair, Peter Attia, so on. I want Jane Goodall's longevity protocol. I think about that, like Betty White and the Queen, these people who lived a long time and never took a single.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, again, there's lots of reasons why some individuals live longer and maintain function and other individuals don't. So a lot of it's lifestyle, obviously. Some of it's genetics. Some of it is, the attitude with which you approach life, I think plays a big role. But all of those people are undergoing biological aging. All of them eventually go through functional declines, get diseases of aging, and die. Yeah. Right? So I don't think that it's mutually exclusive to aspire to achieve a healthy longevity similar to some of those people, and also aspire to understand the mechanisms of biological aging so we can do even better, right?
Yeah. So do a couple more. So stop listening to Sinclair when he blocked Dr. Stanfield. An honest person doesn't block, he engages and explains. And the last one I saw, which I liked, was the two best things you can do to improve your health and extend your life is to stop consuming processed foods and get regular, vigorous exercise. Both are free. Well, foods aren't free. Anyway, your body does not suffer from a deficiency of pills and potions. I kind of like that last sentence a little bit.
I mean, again, I think that is accurate to some extent, right? Again, we know lifestyle factors are the most effective levers we have to pull right now. So yes, eating a healthy diet, which largely consists of reducing highly processed foods, although not exclusively, reducing alcohol consumption, exercising regularly, getting good sleep, reducing stress, focusing on human connection, having a fulfilled life. Yes, all of those things are important to maximizing health span and presumably maximizing longevity. Again, that's not mutually exclusive with the idea that there are pills and supplements that could be additive or potentially make up for deficiencies in those areas. Yeah. I think the problem is we don't have the science and we don't have enough data around the pills and supplements yet to know which ones we can be confident in, which ones are likely to be effective, which ones are snake oil. Right. Yeah. So I think that's just the nature of kind of where we're at in the maturation of this field. The last thing I will say, again, because I think you can't say it too much, the reason why lifestyle factors improve health span and reduce your risk of every age-related disease is because they modulate the biology of aging. That's why lifestyle works. And that's important for people to understand. All I'm saying is the better we can understand that biology of aging, the more opportunities we have to move the needle in a positive direction, perhaps through additional lifestyle modifications, perhaps through supplements and drugs, perhaps through other types of interventions.
Yep. I think there's a place for both. Like I talk to Ben over at Aura all the time. So over here, like I live more in the exercise realm, nutrition, the pillars we talk about. And over there, they're doing research on different molecules. And we talk to each other and we both are sort of learning. And I think we need both types of people.
Right. And I think, there is there are a group of people who sort of naturally push back against the idea that a pill can make up for having a bad lifestyle. That's true right now. Is it theoretically impossible that we someday, won't have a pill that gives you the benefits of exercise without exercise? I mean, it's theoretically possible that could happen. So I don't see any reason to think that's impossible. But yeah, for right now, we don't have that. We are starting to get drugs that can help with lifestyle. Like, again, I think we can point to the GLP-1 agonists, which basically induce caloric restriction. That's basically mostly what they're doing.
Yeah, through appetite
They
suppressant.
cause people to eat less. That is a pill that can help when used properly, with some of the lifestyle challenges that many people experience. Are there downsides to GLP-1 agonists? Yeah. If you don't do resistance training at the same time, you will likely lose lean mass at the same time you're losing fat mass. That's going to be true of caloric restriction. If you could just stop eating as much, you're also going to lose lean mass if you aren't doing something to maintain the lean mass. So I think we're starting to see cases where pills, potentially supplements, can aid in optimizing your lifestyle. And maybe someday we'll get pills and or supplements that can substitute for lifestyle. As far as I know, we don't have that right now.
One of these days we'll do a video about what we take.
Yes, we'll get on that.
All right, man. Well, that was entertaining and learned a lot.
I hope people enjoy this format. Again, we'll see if it ever airs. I'm still of a mixed mind about it, but yeah. Assuming you're watching this, then that means we decided to go with it, and hopefully you enjoyed it. As always, let us know in the comments below. If you're not yet a subscriber, you should hit that subscribe button. I'm guessing by the time this airs, we'll be over 10,000, which is a nice milestone for us. Obviously, as you can tell, we're trying hard not to put stuff out as clickbait and to do this the right way. So again, please give us your feedback. And we hope to see you next time on the Optispan podcast.